The Haunting of Cedar Hollow. It was the summer of 1997 when Emma and her family moved to a small town called Cedar Hollow. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the town was quiet, with sprawling forests and only a few hundred residents. Her parents had bought a large, old Victorian house on the outskirts, a place that had stood for over a century. Despite its grand exterior, something about the house felt off from the moment they moved in. The first few weeks were uneventful. Emma, being 14, spent her days exploring the woods or sketching in her room. The creaking floors and distant sounds of wind rattling the windows seemed normal for a house of that age. But soon, she started noticing subtle changes. At night, she could hear faint whispering, almost like a distant conversation, too quiet to understand but constant enough to unnerve her. She mentioned it to her parents, but they brushed it off, telling her it was just the house settling. One night, things took a darker turn. Emma woke up around 3 a.m., a strange time that always filled her with dread. Her room felt colder than usual, and the familiar whispering seemed louder, closer. This time, it wasn't just a murmur. It was a voice, clear and low, repeating the same chilling phrase, "Come find me." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside her door. Mustering up the courage, she crept out of bed and opened the door slowly. The hallway was dark, save for the dim glow of the moonlight filtering in through the windows. The whispering continued, now more distinct. "Come find me." It led her to the attic. The attic door had always been locked, but tonight it was slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened as she pushed it open. A narrow staircase led up into darkness. Emma hesitated for a moment, then began her ascent, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the top, she fumbled for the light switch, but when she flipped it, nothing happened. The attic was freezing cold, and the air felt thick. As her eyes adjusted to the dark, she noticed a large wooden chest in the corner, covered in dust. The whispers stopped, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than the air itself. Drawn to the chest, Emma knelt beside it, brushing off the thick layer of dust with trembling hands. She lifted the heavy lid, and inside she found something that made her blood run cold. There were old photographs, yellowed with age, scattered in the chest. In each photo there were children, some laughing, some playing, and some staring directly at the camera. But one thing was eerily consistent. They were all standing in front of Emma's house. The photos were dated from the early 1900s up until the 1950s. Emma's heart sank as she sifted through the photos, realizing that all the children in the pictures seemed to be from different eras. But they were always there, frozen in time, outside the same house she now called home. As she reached the bottom of the pile, she found a journal. Its pages were brittle, and the handwriting was shaky. It detailed the life of a woman named Abigail Ward, who had lived in the house decades before. The journal entries started innocently enough. Abigail spoke of her daily life, the seasons, and the town. But soon the tone darkened. Abigail had lost a child. Her daughter, Clara, had disappeared one winter night in 1923. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks, but Clara was never found. Abigail wrote of her heartbreak, but then her entries grew erratic, talking about strange sounds in the house and visions of her lost daughter. She believed Clara's spirit was trapped in the house and had become one of many lost souls who haunted the grounds. The last entry was the most chilling. "I hear her at night, calling to me. I tried to follow her, but it led me to places I cannot describe. I am not alone here. There are others, and they want to take me too. If you find this journal, be warned. The house is hungry, and it will not stop." At that moment, the temperature in the attic dropped even further, and Emma felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned around. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a little girl. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she wore a white nightgown covered in dirt. She stared directly at Emma, her lips parting to whisper, "Come find me." Emma bolted down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she raced back to her room. She slammed the door shut, her heart racing, and dove under the covers, praying for daylight to come. The next morning, she told her parents everything. At first, they dismissed it as a nightmare, but the fear in her eyes made them pause. Her father decided to investigate the attic. When he returned, he was pale and silent, carrying the same chest Emma had found. Her mother's expression changed as they looked through the photographs together, realizing the truth. There were too many coincidences. They moved out of the house within the week. The new owners, unaware of its history, took over soon after. Years later, Emma learned that the house had stood empty for months before it was demolished. But some say that if you pass by Cedar Hollow at night, you can still hear the whispers of lost children calling out from the shadows. "Come find me!" No one ever does. The Forgotten Room. It was a rainy autumn afternoon when Jake and his family moved into the old farmhouse. The place had been abandoned for years, sitting on a lonely hill just outside town. It was the kind of house people whispered about, but no one dared to explore. Jake's parents, however, thought it was the perfect fixer-upper, a house with character, as they called it. From the moment they arrived, something felt off. The house had a strange, oppressive atmosphere, as if the very walls were watching them. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mildew and dust, but it wasn't just that, it was the silence. Even with the wind howling outside, the inside of the house was deathly quiet. Jake, being the curious teenager he was, took it upon himself to explore the house while his parents started unpacking. The first floor was typical: a large kitchen, an old dining room, and a living room with a fireplace that hadn't seen flames in decades. But upstairs, things got strange. At the end of a long, narrow hallway was a door. Unlike the others, it had no handle. It was just a solid wooden door with no way to open it. Jake pressed his ear to it, but all he could hear was the faintest hum of something beyond. He called to his parents, but they were busy, dismissing it as just another thing that needs fixing. The next few days were uneventful, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the door was more than just an old, sealed room. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing strange creaks and whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls. His sleep was plagued with nightmares, visions of dark, twisted corridors and shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his room. One night, the nightmares became too much. He woke up, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The air in his room felt thick, like it was harder to breathe. That's when he heard it. Soft, almost inaudible but unmistakable. A tapping sound, like fingers drumming against wood. It was coming from the door at the end of the hall. Jake grabbed a flashlight and crept out of bed. His bare feet made no sound on the old wooden floors as he approached the door. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was on the other side, waiting. He stood in front of the door, heart racing, and then something changed. The tapping stopped, and the air grew unnaturally cold. Without thinking, Jake raised his hand and knocked 3 times. For a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the door began to creak open. Inside was a small, forgotten room. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Dust covered every surface, and the only light came from his flashlight beam, which danced across the walls. There was nothing unusual at first, just an old bed, a dresser, and a broken mirror hanging on the wall. But as Jake stepped inside, he noticed something strange. The floor was covered in deep scratch marks, as if something had been clawing to get out. He felt a sudden chill and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Panic set in as he banged on the door, yelling for help, but the walls seemed to swallow his voice. That's when he saw it. In the broken mirror, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, a man, hunched and twisted, with sunken eyes and a mouth that stretched into an unnatural grin. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, and his clothes hung in tatters from his gaunt frame. But what terrified Jake most was the man's eyes, black, hollow, and staring directly at him. Frozen with fear, Jake watched as the figure began to move, slowly, dragging itself across the room toward him. Its bony fingers scratched against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out. He backed into the corner, his flashlight flickering madly, casting the room into alternating moments of light and darkness. The figure crawled closer, its grin widening, revealing jagged, broken teeth. Just as it was about to reach him, the door burst open, and Jake's father stood in the doorway, looking confused and concerned. The figure vanished, and the room was suddenly still. Jake was too shaken to explain what had happened. His father assumed he had a nightmare and helped him back to bed. But Jake knew better. The figure had been real. The room was real. And something was very, very wrong with that house. The next day, Jake tried to tell his parents, but they didn't believe him. He felt isolated, like the house was closing in on him, and the more he tried to ignore the room, the more it called to him. Every night, he heard the tapping again, and every night, he resisted the urge to go back. One evening, Jake's mother was cleaning the attic when she found something strange. An old journal hidden behind a pile of forgotten boxes. The journal belonged to the previous owner, a man named Samuel Reeves, who had lived in the house with his family years ago. The last entry in the journal sent chills down her spine. "I hear the tapping again. The room is calling me. I fear what I have let in, what I have unleashed. It wants to be free, and it won't stop until it is. God help whoever finds this." That night, Jake's parents finally believed him. But by then, it was too late. The forgotten room was awake, and what had been sealed inside it for so long was free once more.